A couple years ago, I made a video about how trying to fight multiple attackers is a dumb thing to do because you're probably going to lose. Instead, you should pretty much always run away. But can you learn how to run away better? Well, also a couple years ago, Sensei Seth had the admittedly great idea to practice running away from multiple attackers by training with parkour athletes and competitive tag players.
I headed over to a local parkour club at NC State to test if I could actually get away from people.
I'll be right behind you.
That's a great idea because if you want to know how something is done, ask the professionals. However, most public places don't have the wall and railing density that would make parkour feasible. I don't know how helpful parkour is when every public place in America is lawns, parking lots, and walls that cannot reasonably be climbed. Plus, getting tagged isn't meaningful in a fight. Just because someone can touch me doesn't mean that they can hurt me or trap me long enough for their friends to hurt me. So, what would be really helpful is if there were people out there whose full-time job is escaping groups of well-trained athletes and trying to reach some sort of destination safe zone. It would be even better if that job were part of a well-funded activity that brought in the best athletes and strategists to optimize how to run away. And wouldn't you know, I've perfectly described a running back from American football. Now, my caveat for this video is that I don't know how football works, and I'm not particularly good at any of the techniques in this video. Instead, I did my best to research the topic and give a brief overview of some of the elements most applicable to self-defense. So if my terminology differs from American football, or my example scenarios are unrealistic to the game, that's intentional. I'm not trying to explain the game of football. I'm trying to cannibalize its techniques for useful self-defense tools. Also, if you wish I had picked rugby or something, note that I'm American, the plurality of my audience is American, and rugby doesn't exist here. Now, what can running backs teach us about how to run away from groups of people? The first thing a running back needs to do is locate the gaps in their opponent's line that will allow them to slip through and make a break for it. The way that a running back identifies gaps are a bit different than how you would do so in a self-defense situation. Running backs have it easier in that there's an entire team trying to open gaps for them, but harder in that they have to travel in a particular direction, towards the end zone. If the hooligans are all in between you and the police station a block away, you can still run away from both of them. Running from the bad guys might not be as good as reaching the police station, but it's still a whole lot better than failing to reach the police station. Pick a direction based on your goals and the probability of success. Now, if you're in a room and the bad guys are in between you and the only exit, you'll have no choice but to actually go through them. And that's when you have to find the gaps and pick a lane. Pay attention to not only how large the gaps are, but how well they're being defended. An opponent with forward momentum who is actively cutting off the gap might ruin your chances of getting through, while a smaller gap with a less active or more obstructed opponent might actually be a better option. What's important here is not the size of the gap, but instead your odds of being intercepted. Suppose you're in a situation where you have two opponents in front of you. The left opponent is stock still, sitting on his heels. Maybe he's even looking at something else for the moment. He's not very courageous, and he's probably only going to engage you if he feels like he has to. The right opponent, however, is committed to taking your head off. He is on the move and has a lot of momentum trying to cut off the center. While the largest gap available is the one in between the two opponents, it's actually your worst option. Instead of looking at gap sizes, you need to look at whether you can beat them to the intercept, which is the point at which your paths of travel cross over each other. If you can get to the intercept first, your opponent will miss you and they'll be stuck chasing your dust. However, if your opponent gets to the intercept first, your route is now cut off. And if you hit the intercept at the same time, you get tackled and quickly dogpiled by all of the other opponents. Your goal is to beat your opponent to the intercept by either making his path longer and yours shorter, or by forcing him to turn, and therefore waste energy. If you go down lane B, which is the biggest gap, your opponent will hit the intercept first, and you'll lose. However, if you take lane A, the aggressive opponent won't be able to catch you, and your odds of getting past the guy with no momentum is way better than blasting past the guy with a ton of momentum. Likewise, if you take lane C, it will come down to your opponent's reaction time and turning abilities, which still gives you a better chance than going down the center, and gives you the possibility of beating both opponents to the intercept, and not even getting touched. Ideally, you should be looking for not the gaps that are largest, but for the gaps that allow you to beat them to the intercept. Essentially, which gaps will be the largest by the time you actually get there. And if there is no gap, target the weakest opponent that has the least momentum and do your best. Of course, we can do more to increase our odds than just picking a lane. We can also add cuts, which are quick directional changes, and jukes, which are directional fakeouts that leave opponents guessing. I've seen several overlapping terms to describe these concepts, but this is how I'm operationally defining them for this video. So if we go back to our example from before, we can increase our odds of a clean escape by using a cut to open up a gap. Instead of simply running for lane C, we can go for lane B and then cut right just before a collision. Now we've made our opponent miss the intercept and whiz right past us, forcing them to completely reverse direction to chase after us. Plus, we've opened up an even larger gap where neither opponent is likely to intercept us. If we had instead chosen lane A, he would have only had to adjust his trajectory slightly, and the less aggressive opponent is still in play. Cutting past our opponent to lane C is great, but we have to know how to cut correctly. Quick directional changes are more challenging when you can't use cleats on grass, and any slip or stumble here could spell disaster. Now, when changing direction, your instinct is probably to post your foot out wide to try and absorb the impact, but this is the worst thing you could do. Sticking your leg out wide means that your contact point is going to be on your heel, which is way slower to push off of, and significantly raises the likelihood of a knee injury. In addition, putting your foot that far outside the frame of your body means that you are now landing at a very acute angle with the ground. Unless you're wearing your tactical self-defense cleats, this angle will create an increased risk of slipping, especially if the floor happens to be wet or slippery. And in this context, slipping doesn't result in losing a first down. It results in violence and possibly death. Instead, move your hips with your feet, keeping your legs under you, and land on the ball of your foot. This lowers your likelihood of slipping and allows you to spring out more quickly. Now that you know the basics of body positioning in a cut, let's look at some specific footwork patterns and what they can help us accomplish. First, let's look at a speed drop, which involves a sharp 90-degree angle turn from a relatively high speed. We can conceptualize the speed drop down into 4 steps: drop, break, drive, and line. The drop step involves digging the ball of your foot into the ground and dropping your hips down in order to quickly slow down and get ready to cut. This requires your knee to be bent and for your shin to be largely vertical, making sure that you don't step outside of your frame by keeping your feet only slightly in front of your hips. Your chest should also drop down towards your knees to further lower your center of mass. Bending at the waist without dropping your hips doesn't sufficiently lower your center of mass and will probably result in you tipping over your feet and face planting. If you need to come to a complete halt from a high speed, you can have multiple drop steps, but I'll usually be referring to the last one as the drop step. Next, your break step reaches out at a 45-degree angle and braces into the ground in order to push you in the opposite direction. Your foot should be turned slightly inside to help with the turn. Your knees should be bent, and your leg should still be largely within your frame to maximize control and prevent injury. Your drive and line steps should then be used to shed the last remnants of your former momentum and to drive your hips into their new direction while coming out of your crouched position. The drive step will look kind of like a turning cross step because of your bank angle in the turn. However, when cutting at slower speeds, this cross step and bank angle aspects will likely be less pronounced. The line step should be roughly in line with your new direction of travel and should see your bank angle begin to decrease. Every step afterwards should just be in a straight sprint. The drop, break, drive, and line steps allow you to make hard, sharp turns while also serving as helpful reference points for understanding other cuts and jukes. Slowing down with a drop step is an important element of many cuts, as it can cause your opponent to completely misjudge the timing of their intercept and sail past you. However, you might not always want to lose that much speed, and that's where the speed cut comes in. A speed cut is similar to the speed drop, except that it lacks the distinct drop step and instead begins with the break step. This necessitates changing direction without slowing down first, which requires great body control. The speed cut can be much more sudden and unexpected while keeping your speed. However, that momentum also makes it much harder to cut at a sharp angle, meaning that speed cuts are often either more shallow angles or they involve more of a curved route on your drive and line steps. The speed cut is especially useful on more shallow angled cuts to avoid the intercept without giving the people trailing behind you a chance to close distance. In addition, the jump cut can be used when you don't want to change your direction of travel, but you do want to translate your line of travel. This can be useful for when you want to move past someone rushing towards you without heading off in a new direction. Come to a stop using your drop steps, and then use your break step to launch directly sideways without turning your hips or body to either side. The goal here is to move laterally without wasting energy on turning or jumping high. Your hips should continue facing the same direction and should have minimal upward movement throughout the jump. The speed drop, speed cut, and jump cut are just some of the many different ways to cut, but they can hopefully serve as a foundation to help understand the basic principles involved. Cutting works great, but you're not the only one that can change directions. If your opponent seems ready for a sudden directional change, a quick surprise might not be enough. Now you need to trick them. You need deception. You need juking. Juking is any way in which you confuse or trick your opponent into thinking you're going to cut in a direction that you're not actually going to go. The simplest way to do this is to not have any tells on your cuts.
If you're going for a cut, turning your shoulders, hips, or legs to the side is a dead giveaway as to which direction you're going to go. Instead, keep your body facing forward and don't turn until you've already used your break step to push off in the new direction. This will force your opponent to guess which way you're going to turn until you actually push off your break step. You can make this more confusing by using the inset. To do this, disguise your drop step as a break step by pointing your body away from that step. Face the direction of your actual break step as if it were a drive step before pushing off and violently shifting your body to the other side. Essentially, look left, move right. Of course, if your opponent isn't fooled by you simply facing the wrong direction, you can use a rocker step. After your break step, turn your drive step into a second break step to shift back in the opposite direction. The key to this is actually committing your hips to both sides to really sell the fake and convincing your opponent to commit their body in the wrong direction. A similar tactic can be accomplished with a spin move. Simply drop step and plant what looks like a break step, but instead of pushing off of that step, push off of your rear leg and pivot on your lead leg. This allows you to move towards your quote-unquote break step instead of away from it, and causes your body to turn the opposite direction that you're traveling. And it gives you the option of accelerating out of your spin anywhere within a given directional arc, making it very difficult for your opponent to know where to try and intercept you.
However, the downside of most cuts and jukes is that they tend to bleed energy. Slowing down and changing directions might allow you to outmaneuver the person in front of you, but it also gives you the person behind you ample time to catch up. And because you're both traveling in the same direction, anyone more than a few feet behind you only has to make relatively small directional changes when you cut or juke, meaning that those maneuvers aren't going to throw them off until they're already too close for comfort. There's no perfect solution to this. It's just something that you have to keep in mind. And it's why the athletic ability to accelerate and run quickly can be really important. Now, not every chase takes place in an open road, and football does largely fail to account for one thing that we do commonly see in self-defense situations: stationary obstacles. Tables, columns, vehicles, signs, most public places have dozens of obstacles waiting to be exploited. You can use these obstacles to your advantage by maneuvering them into your opponent's path to block the intercept. If the current intercept is near an obstacle, you can cut behind the obstacle at the last second to put it in between you and your opponent, leaving your opponent unable to match your cut without running face first into a column. This forces your opponent to bleed energy going around the obstacle, effectively giving you a head start. In addition, you can use larger obstacles to hide your movements by cutting at the moment you're hidden from view, giving you an extra second or two before your opponent is able to adjust. And be mindful of obstacles when looking for gaps. If used incorrectly, you could pin yourself in place by limiting your options on changing directions. If used correctly, you can force your opponent to attempt intercepts that are further back and at more acute angles. Acute angles are important because obtuse angles, or head-on collisions, force you to execute skillful cuts to avoid opponents. That slows you down and forces you to turn away from the direction you might want to run in. However, acute angles mean that your opponent is largely behind you, meaning you just have to run faster than them and you're home free. Think about it. When running away, would you rather have your opponents in front of you or behind you? If we go back to our example from before, we can see how adding an obstacle might change the calculus of our decisions. If we put an obstacle here, our cut towards the side will be more effective because we'll be momentarily hidden from view, and our opponent will be forced to go all the way around the obstacle to follow us. If there's an obstacle here, we might decide to go with lane A, because our fast opponent will have to adjust to a longer, later intercept, meaning we'll only have to avoid the slow, unmotivated opponent. If we're running directly away from an opponent, we can also cut behind an obstacle to force our opponent to guess whether we're making a genuine turn or whether we're going to immediately cut back. And our opponent might have to truly guess if the obstacle prevents them from seeing our second cut. This has an added benefit in that cutting normally allows opponents behind us to catch up, as they're able to cut at a more shallow angle in order to follow the diagonal of our angle. However, the obstacle prevents them from doing so, forcing them to take the same path we took, meaning that we can simply run down our opponent's blind path without any real cost. Now, if you do find yourself unable to avoid or outmaneuver one or more of your opponents, there's still one last trick you can use to prevent them from tying you up or slowing you down: the stiff arm. The goal of the stiff arm is to prevent them from getting a solid hold of your torso or legs. It's usually best to stiff arm their face and head, as controlling the head makes it easier to control the body, and sticking your hand in their face can also obstruct their vision and threaten to poke them in the eyes. It's important that you don't hold your arm outstretched, waiting for them to get close enough to touch. This is because it gives your opponent an opportunity to read your stiff arm and attempt to swat it out of the way or intentionally duck under it before you even get to use it. In a self-defense situation, the stiff arm doesn't have to be a push or a post, and can instead be a punch or a palm strike that happens to linger on their face just long enough to push them around, allowing you to inflict damage while still running away. The undisputed king of the stiff arm in American football is currently Derrick Henry, who doesn't use a locked out arm to enforce distance, but instead lets them get close enough to chamber his arm and then violently shoves them away, often knocking other professional athletes clean off their feet. Interestingly, most of the stiff arms I see that result in knocking people off their feet are a result of pushing people parallel to the line connecting their feet. Martial artists typically think of this as the direction in which people are the most braced. However, I suspect that shoving someone with the additional momentum of a sprint behind it combines with the fact that your opponent can't be rooted while running, creating a situation where their base can be overpowered, forcing them to cross-step at high speeds. And for those of you that haven't tried it, stumbling forwards or backwards at sprinting speeds is possible, but cross-stepping at those speeds isn't, meaning even highly coordinated athletes hit the ground. However, pushing a 250-pound man through the air with one arm at an angle while running requires some very well-developed shoulder muscles, which is where we can arguably get to the most important part of running away from an attack: athleticism. The thing that all running backs and wide receivers have in common is that they're athletes. Being able to run fast, accelerate, and hit hard is essential to maximizing your chances of getting away. You can be the most technical juker in the world, but if those hooligans can simply outrun you and catch you from behind, then it's going to be really difficult to outrun them. You need to train balance, agility, and changing directions at weird angles with a focus on speed and power. The technical aspects of cutting, accelerating, and sprinting are great, but they only matter if you have the athleticism to pull them off. Not only does fitness give you speed and power, it also gives you the added benefits of muscle mass to tank hits and the agility to get back up if you fall. As an example of why athleticism is necessary, look at the case of Kyle Rittenhouse. Here, Rittenhouse is attempting to get to the police line for safety, which is just slightly off screen, while a large group of people are very tentatively trying to stop him. This is a simple and straightforward multiple attacker scenario. There's a massive police presence within sight, he has a wide road with no significant obstacles, and he has a gun that makes everyone else hesitant to even get near him. Yet, despite this, Rittenhouse jogs slowly at a speed that allows people to easily catch up to him before tripping and getting jumped. I'm not going to go over what happened before or after this moment because you've probably heard about it already, and I'm trying not to get this video demonetized. So let's break down what went wrong for Rittenhouse in this moment. As I discussed in my video on knife defense, if you're going to run, then run! The way you convince groups of people to leave you alone is by convincing them that attacking you is not worth the effort. If they can easily catch up to you, then they probably will. If you're running away like you're trying to break a land speed record, most people either can't or don't want to put forth that much energy. In the case of Rittenhouse, he's already had to run away from one person and shot him, and that level of adrenaline could have very well burnt him out. It's not clear from this video as to whether he's choosing not to go fast or whether he's just starting to fatigue. And the main piece of evidence that he's getting tired is that he then proceeds to seemingly trip over his own feet. Typically, when I see wipeouts from slow running, it's because the person is either too old to react quickly or too tired to react quickly. In addition, pay attention to the fact that Rittenhouse makes no attempt to get up and instead sits to his butt in an attempt to start observing threats and bringing his rifle to bear. Now, compare this to what happens when athletes wipe out. Watch number 28 absolutely eat dirt and immediately pop back up. Here, number 29 gets comically juked and wipes out. However, he gets back up, charges forward, and he's actually the one that makes the tackle. In fact, many athletes even specifically practice accelerating off the ground because of how important it is to recover and get back up to speed. And they practice high stepping over obstacles so they don't trip in the first place. If you want to be able to fight, you have to train for it. If you want to be able to run away, you also have to train for it. So either hit the gym or hit the ground. If you want to learn both running form and exercises to make you faster, I recommend the YouTube channel Simple Speed Coach, whose videos were very helpful to me as I made this video. I actually considered including a technical explanation of how to accelerate and sprint correctly in the same way I did for cutting and juking, but I realized that Simple Speed Coach already has concise explanations in the same lecture style that I would have used, so either go there or use one of the other billion YouTube resources on the subject. In conclusion, running away from a fight is not a choice that you make. It's a skill set that requires time, training, and a whole lot of exercise to use effectively. Avoiding fights is great, but choosing running over fighting doesn't matter if you equally suck at both. If you want to keep learning about cuts, jukes, and identifying gaps, I found the YouTube channel First Down Training and the website usafootball.com to be especially helpful. It surprised me how much learning and technical skill is required for evasive running. And researching this video is the only thing in my life that has ever made me want to play football.